and offensives that didn't work out. In May of that year, you have turmoil in the provisional government. The guy that's currently in charge is Alexander Kerensky. Kerensky seems to want to, of course, stabilize control, but he doesn't have the complete support of all sides, and it looks like his rule is going to be short-lived. By that fall, of September 9th through the 14th, you have a coup attempt, basically on the power, Kerensky and the provisional government. This coup d'etat is led by General Kornilov, who was, of course, had some military support behind him. They attempt to overthrow the provisional government, and their coup fails. By November of 1917, we have yet another attempt on the government. This time it will be successful, and this will be the Bolsheviks, and of course their leader is Vladimir Lenin. The Bolsheviks will seize power. By November 25th, they will have assembly elections for a new constituent government. And the idea, at least, or the hope, is that you are going to have a more representative government in Russia. Not to say, though, that that's really what's going to happen. By January of 1918, the Bolsheviks have already changed their mind as far as having a representative assembly, and they've basically closed the Constituent Assembly and have essentially taken over and instituted somewhat dictatorial powers. The Bolshevik government will use Marxist doctrine, which is basically the doctrine that Karl Marx wrote about in the 1800s. In this doctrine, it talks about the idea of abolishing private property, nationalizing factories. Basically, this means that the country owns the factories and it owns the land. And from that, they will, hopefully, the idea is that everyone will get an equal piece of the pie. They also put in place universal suffrage, kind of. That's to say there's restrictions as far as who can vote. A lot of that comes down to certain levels of society. If you're a serf, you're still not voting. And if you're a woman, for the most part, you're not voting either. And then as 1918 really kicks off, you have the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which basically is the peace treaty that gets Russia out of World War I. Unfortunately, by them signing this treaty, this also pretty much tells the rest of Europe, particularly the Allied powers, that they are no longer a major player, they are no longer helping out the war effort, and they will not be invited to the Treaty of Versailles. When the Bolsheviks secure control in the spring of 1918, this does not mean that there will be peace throughout the countryside. You unfortunately will have a 4-year civil war that will break out between groups known as the Reds and the Whites. And the Reds and the Whites refer to the Bolsheviks, who are the Reds, which a lot of times you guys probably can guess because we talk about the communists being Reds, and that's what the Bolsheviks were. And the Whites were a minority group called the Mensheviks. The Mensheviks are going to be supported by the former Allied nations, so the U.S. will support them, Great Britain will support them. The problem with the Whites and why they aren't successful, despite having an Allied backing, is that they don't have a strong leader, and they aren't able to take on Vladimir Lenin and his strong leadership, and really his well-organized system. One of the reasons why the Bolsheviks are so successful in this 4-year civil war is that the army is led by a guy named Leon Trotsky, who is pictured here. Trotsky may not look like a military genius, but he certainly was, and he was really Vladimir Lenin's right-hand man. The idea of war communism comes into play, this policy of essentially getting your country ready for war, and that the nationalization of the factories and the land, you basically should prep your country at all time to defend itself and to go on the offensive. While you guys were all born in the 90s, I was born in the late 70s, and being a kid growing up in the 80s, we still very much had the fear of war communism coming out of Russia. And Russia, for most of the 1900s into the, maybe even nowadays, has really focused a lot of their energy and resources on building up a huge military and being the best in the world that they can be. Another byproduct of the 4-year civil war was the creation of the Cheka, which becomes the Russian secret police. And unfortunately, the Cheka really wreaks havoc on Russian and ultimately Soviet society for decades to come. And certainly there's probably still some components of the Cheka nowadays. The current president of Russia is Vladimir Putin, who you'll see quite a bit of in the next few weeks with the Olympics in Russia. And he's a little bit of a sketchy character. He's a former KGB operative in East Germany, so he essentially was a spy for years under the Soviet Union. So he's kind of has some interesting takes on things. So as you guys kind of watch the Olympics and you watch the headlines and things coming out of it, think back to how Russia really gets to this point, and it essentially comes out of this Russian Revolution. There were two major Russian revolutions. The first one was 1904 into 1905. This is the one, however, that most historians remember and say this is really the turning point for modern Russian history. So after you've watched this, and you've learned lots, hopefully, please then look at your learning targets and jot something down about the fact that this was indeed a consequence of World War I. And maybe you can see it as perhaps a cause of World War II, because we certainly know that Russia, which will become the Soviet Union, definitely becomes a player in World War II.